On this episode of the Spiritual Gangsta Certified podcast, you guys hear me often talk about astrological literacy. When you know what cycle you're in, you can make conscious choices. You can respond rather than react. You can work with the energy instead of fighting against it or getting caught off guard. Even without being obsessed with your transits or what's going on astrologically, you can still use astrology to kind of map things out for yourself. Essentially, the point of this episode is to help you see one of the clearest cycles that we can track. We're going to be taking a look at Uranus and Gemini and how it's lined up with massive changes in history. Hey, y'all, and welcome back to the Spiritual Gangsta Certified podcast. I am beyond excited to be back with you, but committed to these weekly episodes again, because guess what? It's season 8, and this is episode 2 of season 8. Can you believe that? 8 seasons? Yo! And honestly, I feel like everything we've been through, everything that's happening in the world right now, has just been kind of pulling at me to use my platform to speak on some things that I think would truly be helpful right now. So today's episode is one that I've been wanting to do for a while. And it almost feels like recent events made it clear that, now is definitely time. So I wanted to talk about how astrology isn't just signs and horoscopes, memes and TikTok aesthetics. Astrology is a tool for recognizing cycles, okay? Cycles that show up in history, in society, and in our personal lives. So, if you've been alive and paying attention right about now, the cycles are definitely making themselves known. So, as I'm sure most people know, just recently, President Trump, or if you call him Orange Hitler or whatever you call him, announced that the U.S. striked on Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, here's the thing. Of course, my ears perked up. I started looking into what was going on. I even went to YouTube to find the announcement that Trump gave, right? But after doing that, the first thing I did was pull up a chart for not only the time of the announcement, but the time of the strikes. Because I needed to see some other timing, okay? So precisely when did this happen? We're not going by a date. I'm going to go with Uranus, because I don't say Uranus. I used to, because it used to be funny. But Uranus, shout outs to Jovi Saturn for having me prep to do that, to pronounce it in such a way. But when Uranus was sitting at 29 degrees of Taurus, where it still is now, but will soon end. So that degree is right at the threshold of Gemini, because we count degrees in astrology beginning with 0 and ending with 29. Now, I didn't find that to be random. So, before we dive in, let me set something straight for folks who really want to understand this. We have to talk about Uranus and its use in astrology. So, it was only discovered in 1781. So, anytime we talk about Uranus and historical events that happened before that, we're looking back with modern astrology's eyes or a modern astrology lens, because at the time that some of the older events happened, Uranus wasn't even discovered yet. So the astrologers of those earlier eras weren't tracking Uranus because they didn't know it existed. And back then, Aquarius, the sign Uranus rules in modern astrology, was associated with Saturn, just like Capricorn. Now, it's not uncommon to see planets have more than one sign they rule, a la Venus ruling both Taurus and Libra, and Mercury ruling both Gemini and Virgo. Even though, side note, I have seen several different astrological figures say that we should be attributing Virgo energy to Vulcan. But that's a whole other story. We ain't gonna talk about that today. So when you explore these patterns today, especially when we're talking about Uranus, we're basically using the gift of hindsight. We're applying what we know about Uranus now to see how its cycles lined up with major moments in history. And I'll tell you this, man, that alignment's too clear to ignore. You couldn't ignore it if you wanted to. So in this episode, I'm going to focus mainly on the last 3 Uranus and Gemini cycles, the ones we can look at through the lens of astrologers who did know about Uranus, or at least through modern interpretations that would make sense. But I'll also weave in other examples that just help us see how astrology connects the dots. So you don't want to miss this. Stay tuned for episode 2, season 8 of the Spiritual Gangsta Certified podcast. Let's go.
You're now tuned into Spiritual Gangsta Certified with Illy Bish.
Okay, I hope everybody has been able to kind of keep their wits about them, stay calm, because, I mean, come on now. If you've been looking at the news, if you've been seeing the happenings in the world, it's a scary time. And I just want to preface all of this with saying my goal is not at all to try to scare people. Instead, I want to bring awareness. So let me begin by saying this. Astrology can kind of be looked at, I guess you could say, like a map or a cosmic clock. It's definitely not just about personality traits in, our birth charts or the daily horoscopes we see in the paper, which don't fully represent all that can be gleaned from astrology. Moreover, it's about rhythms, patterns, energies that come back around time and time again. So, please keep in mind that when you study astrology deeply, you start to see it. You see the cycles that mark personal turning points. Like, for example, your Saturn return around age 29 to 30, or Pluto transits that bring deep transformation. And beyond that, there are cycles that shape society as a whole. I think one of the first things that really endeared me to astrology after I started to see how my chart in particular was so apropos to my life was when it clicked for me that you could use astrology to see patterns and cycles in anything. It was when I learned that even countries have a chart. The creation for anything, even inanimate objects, would have a chart and speak to the times that thing came about. So, these cycles don't make things happen in some predestined puppet master kind of way. It's more like what Ra Aku said, shout outs to Ra of cosmophysics. We're seeing how things work in accordance with one another. If you had a giant vat of soup, which is one of the examples that he gave, and you started stirring it in the middle, right? Your spoon is literally in the middle of this giant pot of soup. But when you turn it and you start stirring, eventually the entire soup starts to revolve around in the same motion that you started in the middle. Now, we can kind of look at studying the cycles as the energy that's active being reflected in what's happening. It's like getting a weather report, so to speak. And if we pay attention, which I hope we are, because you definitely have to pay attention when it comes to astrology, we can move with the energy instead of being blindsided by it. So again, it is not my intention to scare people, but I do want to bring things to your attention. So we can think of it like this. Here's a really quick and simple example. You probably wouldn't leave your house without an umbrella if you watched the weather report and knew that a storm was coming, right? Astrology lets us see the energetic storms, the winds of change, and everything within it. It gives us a heads up, particularly if we're looking at things in advance. It's a good way to look at the past too, which is a perfect way to start to learn astrological concepts and themes and see it all just be in play. So, you guys hear me often talk about astrological literacy. Well, this is why it matters. When you know what cycle you're in, you can make conscious choices. You can respond rather than react. And yes, there is definitely a difference between simply responding and reacting. You can work with the energy instead of fighting against it or getting caught off guard. Side note though, I will say this. I don't like being obsessive about much, even though I have been obsessive in my pursuit of astrological knowledge, but I'm not consciously deciding every day to check my transits. First of all, for some of the planets that are slower moving, not much is changing every day. However, even without being obsessed with your transits or what's going on astrologically, you can still use astrology to kind of map things out for yourself. So essentially, the point of this episode is to help you see one of the clearest cycles that we can track, especially considering some recent events. So we're going to be taking a look at Uranus and Gemini and how it's lined up with massive changes in history so that we're just, prepared for what's ahead. With that in mind, let's break down the planetary energy that we're talking about today, because this is where astrology really starts to show its value and its magic, so to speak. Even though it's not magic, this is a beautiful practice and study that shows that there's almost like some matrix code running underneath things. God's plan, if you will. I recently, on the Spiritual Gangsta Certified Facebook page, had shared a post that was about, I'm going to actually pull it up so I'm not misquoting. I thought it was funny personally, but my sense of humor doesn't always bode well with so-called spiritual people. My sense of humor doesn't always bode well with so-called spiritual people. Some of them get really upset by some of the things I say. And, how do I put it? I don't care. I don't. There was a time in my life where I would worry about ruffling feathers, but not anymore. But it was a post by Phoenicia Renee that I shared that said, crystals and astrology is not of God. And it's supposedly said by a bitch having consistent premarital sex. And one person on my post did not like that. You can check that out. I'll link to the post. But I really want people to understand that sometimes what we think things are, when we take a deeper look, we realize we were totally wrong. And given I got into astrology to debunk it while in the midst of my Saturn return, which I didn't even know I was going through because I hadn't learned that much yet. I know what it feels like to view astrology through the lens of, I don't want to say an unbeliever because astrology is not a belief. I've talked about that before. It's a practice, it's a study, and it's its own language. But we're going to begin with Uranus here. Uranus is the planet of disruption. It's the great awakener, the rebel, the one that shakes up whatever has become stagnant or outdated. When Uranus is active, the universe is kind of like, hey, wake up. The old way ain't working no more. Because it's like a stroke of genius for the collective. Uranus is sudden and unexpected. It brings breakthroughs, genius ideas, rebellion, and freedom. So does the sign that it rules, Aquarius. So please keep that in mind. But it's like a lightning bolt to the system. So that's why Uranus is tied to revolution, scientific discoveries, technological leaps, and big collective shifts. Now, when we look at modern astrology, Uranus rules Aquarius. This is the sign that's connected to those same things, but it's also connected to innovation, community, and the future. But like I said earlier, before Uranus was discovered, those themes were assigned to Saturn. So everything I'm saying about Uranus here is coming from what we've learned since its discovery in 1781. Now, since we're talking about Uranus entering Gemini, let's get into Gemini. Of course, it's Mercury ruled. It's the sign of communication, connection, and ideas. It's the messenger. Gemini is quick-witted, curious, always asking questions, gathering information all the time. So it rules over networks, travel, learning, trade, media. Okay? Now, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Gemini's symbol is the twins. And I should tell you something right there. Because Gemini contains opposites or duality, about seeing both sides. And sometimes that means it can create splits, contradictions, or polarization. I hear a lot of people talk about like Gemini suns and I'll be like, I can't stand them. They don't make any sense. They're two-faced. They're always contradicting themselves. And when you think about where the twins come from, Castor and Pollux, the higher mind of man versus the lower mind of man, so to speak, it makes sense. This is like the energies of two opposing ideas in one. So when Uranus moves through Gemini, we're going to get to a time where information spreads fast, communication and technology leap forward, all these old ideas will get disrupted, and sometimes societies get divided into opposing camps because, the new ways and the old ways are clashing. It's like plugging Uranus's electricity into Gemini's nervous system. Things move fast. Change comes fast. Ideas spread like wildfire, for better and unfortunately for worse. So that's why Uranus and Gemini is such a powerful cycle for us to be looking at. So that's what we finna do. Now, wow. When we think about this historically, some very interesting things rise to the surface. So we're first going to look at the American Revolutionary War when Uranus was in Gemini between 1774 and 1782. Now, close your eyes if you must. Picture this. It's the 1770s. The American colonies are done with British control. Tension had been building for years. They were sick of taxes, restrictions, being treated like second-class citizens. And then that spark hit. Now, astrologically, Uranus had just entered Gemini in June of 1774. It retrograded back briefly, then re-entered Gemini in April 1775, right as the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. So that was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Now, the first thing that I think about when I'm thinking about war is death, guns, weapons. I don't like war. I don't know many people that do, but I don't like it. I can't help but think of the devastation, the so-called collateral damage of people losing their lives. That really doesn't sit well with me. So we know, weapons are going to come to front of mind. Death will come front to mind. But honestly, the Revolutionary War, and I mean, I'm going to speak about this as forward as I can without getting too much of my opinion in there, because there's that part of me, and I'm originally from Philadelphia, where America was so-called born. So, as a young Philadelphian, you're taken to see the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall and all the historical things like Betsy Ross House, which I don't even think is open anymore. Like, you go there in second, third, fourth grade. It was so funny. I used to work in a building that was literally right across the street from Independence Hall. And outside of the building that I work with, there was a signature walk. So all the people who had signed the Declaration of Independence were on this walk. And there's like little plaques in the ground. And, people from my job would be outside smoking cigarettes and whatnot, watching all the tourists go down the signature walk and kind of like laughing because like here people are putting their cigarettes out on this shit. Yet this is a tourist spot, right? But when we think of the Revolutionary War, it wasn't just a war of guns. It was a war of ideas, a war of communication. There were pamphlets that started to be distributed, like one called Common Sense. There were speeches, declaration, words became weapons. The Declaration of Independence itself was a weapon of communication. Now, of course, back then, they didn't have the technology that we have now. So it's not like, can you imagine if Twitter existed? Oh, I'm sorry. I still have not switched over to calling it X. It's going to be Twitter to me forever. If the declaration was like tweeted. Oh, God. But, information took a little longer to spread, but it still was spreading like wildfire. The colonies weren't just fighting for the land, so to speak. They were kind of fighting for a new identity and a new structure that would be separate from England. That very much does speak to the energy of Uranus being in Gemini. Now, keep in mind that this is one of those moments, in us speaking about the Revolutionary War, where we're looking back with modern astrology, as the astrologers at the time didn't even know Uranus was out there shaking things up. But looking in hindsight, the pattern should be and is crystal clear. Now, we're going to go forward in time, but at the same time, going backwards for us from our point of view. So if we fast forward 84 years from the Revolutionary War, Uranus entered Gemini again in 1858. Man, America was literally tearing at the seams. By April 1861, with Uranus around 9 degrees of Gemini, the Civil War erupted. I guess I could talk about decans and duads. I don't want this to go over people's heads. So let's see. 9 degrees of Gemini would be Gemini energy in the Gemini decan. But it would be the Virgo duad. I use decans and duads a lot when I just want to look under the surface to see what energies are present. So you could kind of look at it like 2 scoops of Gemini with a scoop of Virgo being under this energy. Now, of course, Gemini and Virgo are both ruled by Mercury. So this has not only to do with information collected, which I would say is more Gemini, but, the meat of it, what it was reduced down to, which would be Virgo. And also, as mutable signs, Gemini and Virgo square each other. And squares talk about friction. So, I mean, was the Civil War erupting not friction? The nation literally was splitting. Literally. I mean, that is the embodiment of that Gemini twin symbolism. It was in some cases brother against brother fighting. Okay, the North against the South. And I mean, I'm not sure what everyone was taught. I'm trying to consider my age here. I was born in 1980. So I remember school being a very specific way, and we were taught very specific things, especially when it came to big events like the Civil War. So it's almost like saying, I feel like they've glazed over things as years have gone by. And I can't even be certain what kids these days are even taught about this. But the war wasn't necessarily about territory so much as it was about the clashing ideas of freedom, human rights, and what the United States was supposed to stand for. Because if we go back to me talking about the Revolutionary War, when I said I didn't want to bring too much of my personal opinion and stuff, there were white men primarily fighting for freedom while black people were enslaved. Some of these people who are in fact fighting for freedom, who signed the Declaration of Independence, had slaves. Even as a child, for me, that was a lot to try to reconcile. I couldn't Gemini that. It wasn't working for me. Then again, I don't have no Gemini placements. It's just my 9th house. Anyway. Okay, now it's really important that we talk about one of the clearest, most layered examples of Uranus's transit in Gemini historically, doing what it does, shifting society through words, laws, communication, and also showing us what happens when communication is delayed. So this is very, very important, and I think one of the clearest things from the past that we can review. During Uranus and Gemini between 1858 and 1866, we got a moment that changed the course of American history, and that moment was the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you're not clear exactly about how this went, let me break it down. Back on September 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So that's to say, it basically was saying, hey, if you're still rebelling, Confederate States, on January 1st, 1863, your enslaved people will be declared free. I do want to point out, in no way, and you can look this up historically, was Lincoln really concerned with, the slaves should be free. There's a lot of research on this, and sometimes history can be upsetting, but it's something that we have to learn. It was to be able to destabilize the South. It was a threat, okay? So, right on schedule, because the South kept rebelling, January 1st, 1863 comes, and the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Now, if we look at this astrologically, you could really see how many different themes are fitting here for, number one, Uranus, revolution, liberation, and sudden change, right? And then Gemini themes like language, documents, information, messaging, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation was a legal declaration that redefined the Civil War from a battle for union into a battle for freedom. So it sparked evolution. Big change came from that. So that's totally Uranus and Gemini, like all day, okay? But here's where it gets even deeper, and again, a lot of historical things, especially surrounding slavery and the treatment of Black Americans in the United States of America, really just is heartbreaking as fuck to me. I sometimes, no matter how much I know, it just takes a hold of me. But even though the proclamation was issued in 1863, we just celebrated what this is about, okay? Not everyone knew about it, or let's be real, not everyone was told, okay? Purposefully. Not everyone wanted this to be known. So this is taking us back to Juneteenth. So on June 19th, 1865, more than 2 years after the proclamation, that's when finally the Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and told the last group of enslaved people that they were free. I cannot fucking imagine. I cannot imagine what they had to be feeling. Okay? That moment, that announcement, that had to be shocking. It had to be shocking. Number one, to hear you're free. And number two, to hear it was delayed. And I'm not even sure if it was delivered that way. I need to probably look more into it. But Uranus was still in Gemini for that happening as well. So we can clearly see that Uranus and Gemini energy isn't just about making bold new declarations, right? We can see a theme here about power and pitfalls in communication. When they say knowledge is fucking power, that it is. It is so much power. To keep people enslaved in the mind, oh my God. You have so much power over them. Oh my God. The proclamation, though not made purposefully for the benefit of slaves, though it did benefit slaves, does show Uranus and Gemini energy at the highest. Okay. Juneteenth, I think, is showing Uranus and Gemini at its realest, where it showed us that revolution, could come late, even if it needed to, but it was going to come. Sometimes, when I think about this event, it's a reminder that even freedom can have a delay in delivery. A way that the message just doesn't get out like it needs to when it needs to, right? But we could talk about that, I guess, being Gemini's shadow, because knowledge exists, information is out there, but not everyone grasps it or receives it or has access to it at the same time. So this is another thing where I'm thinking about looking at cycles through astrology, and people act like astrology isn't a real thing. Well, okay. Sorry to bust your bubble. Not only can I show it to you in so many other ways in personal behavior, but for looking at historical transits and themes that connected them. Please explain to me if this isn't real. How does a planet associated with revolution, when it has traveled through a sign of communication, especially during some of the greatest shifts in American history? How is that possible if this isn't real? When you pay attention, you get so much information. My God. It's like communication was definitely key at this time, because at any moment, something very important could happen. And because they didn't live in times where there were technological advances like what we had now, people were really dependent on, having to get the news through a speech. Somebody could have come through the town and told what happened. I mean, yes, there were newspapers, and the newspapers would report things like the political debates about the war and what was going on. And I mean, it fanned the flames. It does that now in modern times. Flames definitely get fanned with the way media sensationalizes things, twists things, leaves things out, puts things in. It's so much. So far, we're speaking of two critical times in American history and just kind of seeing some of the same patterns. We're going to fast forward a little bit more to World War II. Now, technically, World War II officially started in 1939 while Uranus was still in Taurus. But as Uranus moved to the end of Taurus, to that 29th degree, the same degree I was talking about with the recent strikes on Iran, this was a critical tipping point for the US. Okay, we got drawn into the war with the Pearl Harbor bombings in December of 1941. Uranus was at 27 degrees of Taurus that day. Now, I don't know how many people have actually learned a lot about Pearl Harbor, but I'll tell you this. When I was about 13, my parents used to kidnap us to go on vacation. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the best way I can describe it. What I more so mean is they would not tell you you were going anywhere. You would just usually get woke up in the middle of the night, like the popo was coming, even though like I grew up in a family where my dad was law enforcement, so whatever. But you know, we'd get woke up in the middle of the night, and usually we'd get in a car and be on some impossibly long drive. Only this year, which was 1993, so I was in 8th grade, we went to the airport and I'm like, oh my God, where are we going? We drive everywhere. We went to Hawaii. Oh my God, it's one of the best trips I've ever taken in my life. We did a cruise. We got off at the different ports. I got to see an active volcano. And when we got back off the cruise and came back to Honolulu and stayed in a hotel, then that's when we went and we visited Pearl Harbor. Now, granted, that was 1993 and that was a long time ago at this point. But I remember there was a feeling within me of like, I just felt sad. You could still see the oil like rising up in the water. There were smokestacks still sticking up out of the water. It's something I'll never forget. And I remember I bought back, they were selling in the gift shop some reprints of newspaper articles from the day that happened. So by the time we get to May of 1942, Uranus was firmly in Gemini. Well, what happened then? The world split into massive opposing forces. It was the Allies versus the Axis. And then the Cold War superpowers, the US versus the USSR. Seeing that Gemini duality again, that split, opposing sides, so to speak. So communication, technology, and transport also leapt forward during this time. So yeah, we're seeing war, we're seeing division, we're seeing duality. We saw the first modern computers, Colossus in 1943, ENIAC or ENIAC, I'm not sure how I should be saying it, in 1945. The V-2 rockets reached space in 1944. Radar got bounced off the moon in 1946. The transistor was invented in 1947. And as crazy as this sounds, there was early mobile phone service in 1946. Other things that people don't realize came out in this era were like microwave ovens, long play records, tape recorders, all of that was born in that particular era. So we can see that the world was transformed by technology and communication. And I mean, those are very much Uranus and Gemini things. Now, since as I record this, we are still at the 29th degree of Uranus and Taurus. And it's interesting to me to sit here and go, oh my God, this is the 8th season of my podcast. I actually started the podcast and came out of the astrological closet when Uranus first went into Taurus. It's when I was like, okay, I'm going to finally launch my astrology brand and, you know, come running out the gate. It's when Spiritual Gangsta Certified was officially born, so to speak. Now, my logic for doing it at this time was I was thinking about Uranus and thinking about Taurus. Honestly, if you think about this, since Uranus rules Aquarius and Taurus is a sign, a fixed sign, just like Aquarius, that squares Aquarius, there's friction there. And to me, friction indicates growth. I wanted to be shocked, Uranus, out of my comfort zone, Taurus. It's so funny to think about it now because I was terrified. The only people that really knew I was even remotely into astrology had to be very, very close to me. And there's still a few people to this day that I'm really grateful for. They let me experiment on them, so to speak. They got some free readings though, let me put it that way. But they let me experiment as I was learning up to the point, before I actually launched the brand. I was really doing all this on the low, but I was giving it so much time and attention and energy because I felt called to do so. After learning more about astrology, I started to realize my initial intent to debunk it was not going to work. Because the more I learned, the more I applied what I learned, the more I said, oh my God, there's something here. But it's funny to me to know that I wanted to be shaken up out of my comfort zone. So I chose May 15th when Uranus went into Taurus. Now, we just want to kind of look at the lead up to Uranus going into Gemini again. That's actually going to occur on July 7th. Now, before Uranus moves into Gemini, we always get that period where it's wrapping Taurus up. So, what is Taurus? Material security, food, money, those sorts of things. So, if we look into the 1930s, when Uranus was last in Taurus before now, we had the Great Depression, the New Deal and Social Security, spam, mac and cheese, Toll House cookies, frozen food. I mean, maybe it's the Venus in Taurus and progressed Taurus sun in me, but food innovation was like on point. These things still exist today. And they came about during a time where there was some scarcity, specifically when it came to resources and food. There were also the Dust Bowl agricultural reforms. I think too, what I'll do is try to post some links to information about all of these things, within the description, because I think I would be taking way too much time to record this episode if I went in depth about everything, but it is worth providing you with where you can look to find more information about this out. So we had the food innovation. We had things having to do with material security. And if we think about the cycle from 2018 to 2025, we see a lot of the same themes. Now, the rise in cryptocurrencies. Does anybody remember before 2018 seeing cryptocurrencies be like the thing? There were also plant-based food revolution. Oh my God, everywhere I turned, it was so much more easier to find. Not that there weren't plant-based food solutions before, but there seemed to be an uptick in it. And then another thing that I'm glad was part of this cycle was this push for sustainability. Oh my goodness. I remember talking to my daughter. I can't remember the name of the place that you can go out to that'll teach you how to build sustainable homes. We're like obsessed with that because in my mind, I see my land, all the different ways it's going to be used, but as per it housing my family and being, like a family plot, I want sustainable housing. All these things give very much Uranus and Taurus. So now that we're at the last degree of Uranus and Taurus, we can look back in time and see that it's often a tipping point. And it's almost like a spark that sets the next cycle in motion. Because as my good friend Jovi Saturn says, a new cycle in a planet's transit is showing the results of the previous cycle. So history shows us that the last degree of Taurus is often when the cracks show and pressure is built and right before Uranus moves into Gemini, when things are just going to move a lot faster. So, if you're wondering, what the hell can we expect from Uranus and Gemini this time? Let's think about this for a minute. So, as we're on the edge of Uranus entering Gemini, the first ingress is going to be July 7th, 2025. Then it's going to retrograde back into Taurus on November 8th, 2025. And it won't re-enter Gemini until April 26th of next year. From that point, from April 26, 2026, it's going to stay in Gemini until 2033. First of all, saying 2033 sounds wild. I remember when saying 2020 sounded wild. Time really flies, y'all. But history tells us the following. Here's what we've seen during previous cycles. There was explosions in innovation, in communication, and technology. That's something that, we've seen. Now, with this last cycle, we saw AI integrated into daily life. There's AI assistants, teachers, companions. I mean, I have seen some wild stuff, and I'm not even against AI, so to speak. I'm against laziness. I am not one of those people who feels like, oh my God, it's going to replace us all. That's never how I looked at it. But I don't think that people even are real enough with themselves to be as real as they would need to be with AI to get the most out of it. I do know some people that are that real though, but I'm just saying in general. I've been seeing things like it. I mean, do we want to say AI girlfriend, AI boyfriend? I've been seeing that a lot too. Had never seen it before. And while we have lived in times, particularly I think since Chiron went into Aries, where we keep hearing about like a male loneliness epidemic, I've seen more and more things where men are claiming we're just going to get robots. We don't need women. I'll just get a robot. And I'm seeing women be like, can you hurry up and do that and leave us the fuck alone, please? And I'm sorry, I find that hilarious. But that's been something that's been there. So, quantum computing, brain and computer interfaces, that came up a lot during Uranus and Taurus as like a precursor to what's to come. Autonomous vehicles. I just saw an announcement today. Elon offering I forget exactly what it's called. I'm going to have to look it up again. But, the self-driving cars, you can like order one to come pick you up for $4.20. I saw my cousin online make a joke about, oh, he's definitely a pothead. Ha ha ha. But, autonomous vehicles. Wow. Even possibly commercial space travel. We've seen a lot of people so-called go to space. More well-known people, so to speak. But what if the day comes where that's something available to everybody? I would also say like new media platforms changing how we connect and tell stories. Because if you think about it, the advent of social media and how important it's become to daily life. Listen, it wasn't like this before, When I was back on MySpace in like 2005, I enjoyed MySpace, but, I didn't have to constantly be on there. I have realized that most people are getting their news exclusively from social media platforms. People don't even want to watch the news, some younger people especially. Now, we've also seen throughout history that there's great potential for division, information wars, society shifting rapidly when it comes to approaching the time frame where Uranus enters Gemini. There's definitely ideological polarization getting sharper. And let me tell y'all, the one thing that I can't stand are polarized people. I do not care what side of an issue one is on, because I feel like polarization prevents one from using fully their deductive reasoning and critical thinking skills. It makes people easy to trigger. It makes people easier to anger. And that's really dangerous when you think about, us entering the energy of like the Civil War. It's just crazy. So like battles over truth and misinformation, deep fakes and cyber warfare have all been taken up. Okay. New forms of social conflict or realignment echoing past Uranus and Gemini cycles. It's like, you can't make this stuff up. So this is one of the reasons why astrological literacy matters. When you understand astrology, it enables you to be able to know the cycles that we're entering so that you're not caught off guard. We're able to see the patterns. You can feel the energy. And more importantly, you can choose how you're going to engage with it. Now, far be it from me to try to tell people how to cope with this energy. Far be it from me to tell people, oh, don't be worried. Look, people are going to feel how they want to feel. But regardless, when you're informed, when you have information at your disposal that allows you a very important opportunity, acceptance. We can accept some of what we see, and then we can move from there. Not accepting things is actually what causes a lot of people to suffer, especially when it's things that are beyond your control. We don't have any control over Trump. We don't have any control over Iran. We don't have any control over Israel. In a lot of ways, understanding that the time frames that we're coming into are very much like rife with echoes of the past when it comes to conflict, when it comes to changing minds and division. We shouldn't be surprised that we see this now. And even though I really do want to see humanity do a lot better, I feel like these cycles that we keep going through show how much continued work we still have to do. Uranus moving into Gemini doesn't have to mean, oh my God, this is a complete disaster. But it definitely means things are being shaken up. Things are changing. It means the potential for choice. It means the potential for growth. Gemini is a mutable sign, so it specializes in changing. And because it's an air sign, it has to do with ideas and thoughts, changing minds. How many people would say it would be a good thing for a lot of minds to be changed, for people to be more inspired to help minds change? There's positives here. So here's my invitation essentially for you. Pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on to the best of your ability. I know some people are deciding to limit their access to certain media or sites for their own mental health. But when you are committed to being like super astrologically literate, part of the benefit of that is that if you're paying attention, you're actually getting to see astrology at work. It's important to stay curious. And when you combine astrological knowledge with paying attention to what's going on, and then also add in there looking at the past, you're learning about the cycles that humanity goes through. Because when Uranus enters Gemini, it's going to move fast. And knowing that rhythm can help you dance with it instead of stumbling through it. This is a very different energy than Uranus being in Taurus, because if you think about it, Uranus rules Aquarius, a fixed air sign, and it's lining up in a sign of mutable air. You could literally, if you wanted to, look at that like it's showing how change has to come. Wherever we're fixed, wherever there's polarization and opposing sides, we need some sort of change. And the first step in that is changing minds. So keep in mind that astrology gives us that map, so to speak, that I talked about before. But it's really up to us how we decide to use it. Y'all stay safe out here and stay curious. I'm hoping that for anyone who's been maybe teetering on the verge of looking into astrology deeper, that, you know, stuff like this actually inspires you to learn. And I can't wait to show you guys some of the things that I've been coming up with at your own pace courses to help you do just that. It warms my heart to be able to share this knowledge with people. But please, I know these are difficult times. These are scary times. These are uncertain times. Please understand we're entering yet another cycle that humanity has to go through. And while there'll be some things that we don't like, there'll be some things that kind of shake us up. We're going to get to the other side of it. And before we know it, Uranus will be going into Cancer. But that's a whole other story. I hope y'all have a good day. Stay tuned for the next episode. And I love you all. Thank you for tuning in. Peace.